I've recorded more than 80 videos for this channel, and this is the first one where I'm really going to drill down how I like to write and what process I use and what works for me. Now, I want to say right off the bat, I'm not saying that this is what you should do. This is just what works for me, and you definitely need to do whatever works for you. But what I will say is that I find this process really manageable, fun, and actually pretty easy. If I'm being honest, like it's not. I never feel like I'm really suffering for the writing. It's always really enjoyable. The process that I'm about to explain, I haven't really heard mentioned many places before. So if you're looking for a new perspective, this could be it. So the first thing to say is that I try and write 500 words a day. Here's what 500 words looks like. It's not that much, is it? Now, if I'm feeling really good and it's all flowing out really nicely, then I'll write more than that. But certainly as a base level, I'd really like to achieve 500 a day. And you can see that should be pretty manageable, shouldn't it? Now, what happens if I miss a day? Do I have to write twice as much the next day like NaNoWriMo? No, not at all. All it means is the date that I'm going to launch my book, whenever that happens to be, is being pushed back a day. That's all it means. I don't have to write twice as much the next day. I'm not going to beat myself up. It just means that it's going to take a tiny bit longer until the book is released. If I miss a day, that's another day it's going to take. And I'm fine with that. If your full-time job is writing, then fair enough, you've got to stick to your own deadlines. But if you're a part-timer, or if you're an amateur like me, I don't see anything wrong with just saying, I didn't get any writing done today, but that's cool. It just means that it's going to be an extra day until the book is eventually launched. If I can write twice as much the next day, great, but I don't want to. My real emphasis is I don't want to burn myself out. I don't want to ever beat myself up and just say, oh, you didn't write anything yesterday, now you've got to write twice as much. No, make it really manageable. So manageable that it's actually a pleasure. You think, I can crank out them 500 words so easy. It's going to be a piece of cake, and it feels really nice to just know that you've got this really manageable goal. As soon as you've got a huge goal, I've got to write X amount now, oh God, it's suddenly a lot more difficult. Now, what's 500 words a day going to get you? Well, that's 15,000 in a month, which means that in 2 months, that's a novella. And I'm currently writing a novella series. So, in other words, every couple of months, I could release another book in this series. Now, I don't, because I take breaks in between each one, and they're potentially going to get longer as the series goes on. But in theory, 2 months, the novella is there. 4 months, and you've got yourself a novel. Quite a short novel, but a novel nonetheless. 6 months and you've got yourself a perfectly medium length novel. That means you can write 2 novels a year just from writing 500 words a day. I think that's really great, especially, as I say, for an amateur like me. I'd love to release 2 books a year, and actually because of this method I'm going to be releasing more than 2 books a year this year. But wait a minute, you might be thinking, you're writing 500 words a day, but that doesn't mean that you've got to go back over it and edit it and redraft it and stuff like that. Yeah, I do. I definitely do. But here's the thing, and here's where you might hear some things that you might not hear elsewhere. And please, just remember, I'm not saying that you need to do this. I'm just saying this is what works for me. So I edit as I go. A lot of writers will say, no, just write as fast as you can, get it out on the page, worry about it later. You can always make it better later, but get those words out. And I think that's great advice as well. I think that if that works for you, that is brilliant. I think getting the words out is very important. But for me, I like to write a bit slower. I write sentences quite slowly. And it's not like a grind. I'm not writing them out slowly because every single one is like blood dripping onto the page. I just write slowly because I know that if I take my time now, it's going to be less time that I'm going to have to go over it later. So I will actually take my time with these 500 words. I will really think about what I'm going to say before I say it and put it down on the page. If you read my first book, The Bewilderness, almost all of what you read, believe it or not, is a first draft or a second edit, and very occasionally third, fourth and fifth and so on. But a lot of it, if you read the original notebook that I wrote it down in, it's very, very similar to what ended up in the final copy. Now you could say, Ben, I've read it and it's rubbish, that's why. But hopefully you would read it and not think that it was a first draft and enjoy it. Because in a sense, when I'm writing it, I'm editing it in my head before it goes onto the page. And that sometimes means writing a little bit slower. But it saves me a lot of time in the long run because I don't have to keep going over it and over it and over it. Have you ever seen how a lot of illustrators draw pictures? I just searched for how to draw photorealistic portraits, and the first one I clicked on, the illustrator draws a very sketchy outline of what they want to draw. That to me is my idea, that's my concept, that's my very loose framework in my head of what I'm about to write. Now at that stage, a writer might go over that framework, making each bit a little bit better, the second draft, taking the original framework and making it a little bit better, and then you'd go for the third draft and make the whole face a little bit better again, and then the fourth draft, and so on, and each time you're making the whole face a little bit better. But look what a lot of illustrators do. They've taken the eye, and they've made the eye pretty much as good as it can be before they move on to the next bit. That's how I write, and in fact that's how I do a lot of things in my life. I'm a coder, I write a lot of code. I like to make sure that I'm writing the code good first time, because I know it's going to be a lot harder to go back over it later, try and remember what I did and make it better, when I could just take a little step back, take a little bit more time and make it good first time round. I think it makes a lot of sense to do it that way. The next thing to say is that I write by hand a lot of the time. I write in a notebook, partly because this then slows me down. I think it's a lot quicker to type, but if I'm writing by hand, I feel like my brain takes that a little bit more time. Plus, it's a very direct route from my brain to the words. It's just my arm, and I really like that sort of tactile sensation of, okay, it's just me and the words, and I'm really thinking about what I'm doing. I work on a computer all day, so I really like to take that step back and separate what I'm doing with my writing from what I'm doing during the day. I don't want to look at another screen. I quite like having a pen and a piece of paper, and I write in bed when all other distractions are done. A lot of writers can't write unless they're feeling depressed. Some of the greatest writers throughout history have said that the moment they were happy, that it was like they just couldn't find the art anymore. And not just writers, but other kinds of artists. I can't write unless I'm happy and content, and I feel like everything else is done. So when I write in bed, the kids are in bed, the day is wrapped up, and now I don't have to think about anything. There's nothing else swirling around in my brain except for what I'm about to write. And I find that really helps. It helps with the clarity, helps with this practice of getting it out pretty good first time, because I'm really in that flow. There's nothing else going on in my head except for the writing. It also means that when I come to type it up, that's kind of a second draft, because I will change bits as I'm typing it up. Whether it's a character moment or a bit of description or some dialogue or whatever it happens to be, I won't write it word for word when I type it up. So that in effect is a second draft straight into the document. And I'm usually pretty happy with it by that point. There's going to be bits that I hate and I'm going to delete or change or move around. But for the most part, if I really hated it that much, I wouldn't have typed it up in the document in the first place. And what an illustrator tends to do is to go back over, once it's all there, is to go back over the whole thing and really fill in the finer details and do those finishing touches that are really going to bring it to life. Once it's written, I'll print it, because I like to scribble all over it and make changes in the margins and stuff like that. And my wife will read it, she'll spot any typos and any continuity errors and anything that's just rubbish. She will be honest about it to me. So find someone who's going to be really honest to you about your work. Then I'll make one final edit, and if possible, ask my wife to read it out loud to me together so we can hear it that final time before I go and upload it. So we're getting to a bit of a turning point in this video. What I would like to do is explain why the channel is called 21st Century Writer. The reason I called it that when I created the channel about 6 months ago was that I really think that we're all very busy these days. It's a very busy, hectic, strange life. And I think in this day and age, there are ways that we can write that are easier, less stress, can fit into such a busy, hectic lifestyle, and really bring the practice of writing into the 21st century. Now, one of those ways, I think, is the novella. Novellas traditionally don't sell very well to publishers and agents because you can't really sell it to a bookshop. It's too thin, it's not going to look very great on a bookshelf. They're hard to sell in physical copies, but we're not limited to that anymore. We're quite capable of going online and self-publishing a novella. So with the 500 words a day method that I'm using, within a couple of months, or possibly 10 weeks, 2.5 months, I've got a pretty good novella. Because I took my time, I'm not going to have to go over it many more times. I wrote about 500 words a day, give or take a few days. That's where the extra 2 weeks comes from. But at the end of those 10 weeks, I've got a pretty good novella, or certainly a novella that I'm happy with. Those 2 extra weeks can be used to get a cover ready and signed off. But within 10 weeks, I've got a novella, and within another 10 weeks, I could have the next novella. And before you know it, within a year or so, you've got the makings of a series. And when you're self-publishing, a series is a lot easier to sell because you don't have to start again every time. You're not introducing readers to a whole new universe. You're saying, come along for the journey. And as long as you're selling it at an appropriate price, which might be slightly less than a normal sized novel, you're good to go. In the modern age, as writers, if we're self-publishing, we don't have to worry too much about the traditional way of doing things. We can write whatever we want, and readers will decide whether it's worth paying for or not. So for me, this is a really manageable way of writing. It doesn't burn me out. I find it really manageable to write 500 words a day. If I miss a day, I don't beat myself up. I just understand that I've put the launch off by a day, and that's fine. Even if you miss 3 days a week for a month, that's only 12 days. You can get a cover done in that time. This morning I wrote 250 words on my phone on the way to work. And because I'm writing novellas, every time I write 500 words, that's a real significant dent into the overall word count. And in fact, every week, if you do that, you've written over 10% of the book. Sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes it's so manageable it almost feels like you're cheating in some way, like I'm sucking the art out of it, like I'm just finding shortcuts. But it really doesn't feel like that. I'm writing things that I'm really proud of. I think that the novella is a perfectly legitimate art form. They used to be very popular, especially the idea of the serial where you would publish stories in installments in magazines and things like that. That's very much how I feel that I'm doing it. And I don't feel like I'm taking anything away from the process. If I really want to write a novel, I still will, and I still do, and I try and get those traditionally published. But for self-publishing, for a book that I'm not even 100% sure that people are going to read, it's much less risk for me, I feel, to write a novella rather than invest so much time into writing something much longer. I can put it out there, get a feel for if people like it or not, and hopefully they will, and then I can continue it and continue the series and keep releasing them. So for my self-published work, that is more or less my process. I hope you found it useful. Let me know in the comments if you did find it useful and if that's something you would be willing to try. And let me know what your writing process is. It's always really interesting to hear how other people do it. And thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to check out these 2 videos, and I'll see you in the next one.